So what I'm going to be talking about is mountain meadow restoration, reconciling research and implementation. And this topic is something that I've been more recently getting involved in, and hopefully I'll show you why it's important. So first, I'm going to sort of introduce this session by covering some of the basics. So what are mountain meadows? Basically, they're areas of low gradient where water accumulates and soils tend to accumulate. So they have a shallow water table. And they tend, because of this shallow water table and the sediment accumulation, they tend to have high nutrients, which creates high biodiversity. They also serve, because they're low gradient, they serve as flood attenuation, groundwater recharge, potentially water storage. So as most of our productive habitats in California, they are loved to potentially excess. And due to several of our uses, mountain meadows have become degraded. And it's estimated about 70% have a reduced ecological value currently. And this is Sierra Nevada mainly. So we have 70% of our meadows in a degraded state. So what do we do? What are our options? And the first option is to allow the channel to create a new equilibrium. And basically, I think earlier we heard about the declining baseline idea. And so set a new baseline and allow the new channel to create its own equilibrium. And then that upper floodplain that was once connected is now disconnected. We don't tend to like that option. Assist the channel in reaching a new equilibrium. So if we have an incising situation, we can put riprap in the head cuts, right? And we can do things to try to get to an equilibrium state. Or we can restore that hydraulic grade of the system to reestablish, to reconnect the channel with the floodplain. This is the basic concept. And number 3 is what we're trying to do now, right? We're trying to say, okay, look, our meadows are turning into sagebrush. Let's see if we can't bring that water table back up. So what are some of our restoration techniques to reconnect the channel with the floodplain? So our goal is that pristine condition where the channel flows through the meadow, it's connected, and those vegetated sediment layer acts as a sponge and then holds that water, and then it's made use by plants and animals. So that's our goal. In the degraded state, we have an incised channel flowing through the meadow. It acts as a drain whereby the water doesn't reach that spongy area and just flows on through the meadow. And so pond and plug or plug and pond, whichever is your favorite, is an example of what is being done currently to reconnect or re-water the meadow. And basically what the idea is to block that incised channel, to build a series of ponds where you're basically excavating to create plugs or dams that stop the water from flowing in that historical channel and moving it and allowing it to feed the water into the existing meadow floodplain and on historical channels on that floodplain. So you can see many examples. You can play on Google Earth, and especially if you go into that Feather River watershed, you can see these examples of pond and plug. So this is a picture of Smith Creek and before and after the pond and plug. And so you can see very clearly that series of of ponds and plugs that occur, and then the water is put on that existing meadow. So there are a lot of success stories associated with these types of restoration. So it's this, basically you bring in the heavy equipment, you build these pond and plugs, and bam, you get some water back on that floodplain, and where you had a system draining the meadow, you now have sediment storage, flooding on that floodplain, which is what you want, groundwater storage, and the plants and animals respond to that water. In terms of research, there have been an amazing shortage of studies on these types of projects. They are mostly hydrological and have shown raised water tables, increased duration of inundation, and especially this decreased magnitude of flood peaks, which can be really helpful for downstream. One concern is that most of these projects have occurred in a few well-funded projects. So in terms of what's happening across California and the range of projects, we don't really have a good sense of what's going on. So it's difficult for us in Forest Service research to make recommendations to land managers. We don't know what you should do. So I won't get into the background of why I came into this, but we basically said, okay, we can't tell what's going on. And so we just did a study where we said, okay, let's take the existing projects in the Sierra Nevada, throw them in a hat, pick 10 of them out, and then pair those 10 with unrestored meadows nearby within a 5-kilometer radius and 10 kilometers in a couple cases. So we did that, and we got several meadows across the Sierra Nevada, up in Shasta, and we tried to pair them as well as possible and focused on Forest Service lands so that they have a similar management history. And we predicted that the restored meadows would score higher than our control meadows, basically because of this 70% degraded estimate. And we looked at biomass, cover, wetland status, and soil carbon, and then also channel condition, which basically was looking for head cuts, nick points, those types of things. And we measured the depth of the head cuts. And what we found somewhat surprised us. So in terms of proportion, wetlands are up on the top left. Our untreated sites scored higher than our treated meadows, most of which were pond and plug. And then soil carbon also was higher in the controls. And then channel condition, down here, this is actually an index of areas of instability, and the treated didn't want to score higher. It meant that we saw more signs of instability. And so why did we see those results? The first is that we didn't do a good job. We were looking at restoration and we were comparing apples and oranges, which could very well be. Regardless, they should still score high, I would argue. But there's certainly true that those projects, those meadows that were restored would be highly degraded to start out with. So they were the most degraded, so they're doing better. We're not talking about a before-after here. So there's no doubt they're doing better. Not enough time. Certainly soil carbon, you would think it would take years the soil to build up in carbon. Productivity and the others would be quicker. But we looked at, so that we took the 10 projects and we put the project age, so on the x-axis, and then our variables that we measured on the y-axis. And while there's a lot of scatter here, the trend held the same, where the newer, the more recent projects scored higher in everything. That's great from a perspective of, it seems like we might be doing better at meadow restoration. But in terms of not enough time, it suggests that maybe there was, at least to some degree, enough time for these variables to express themselves. And then the last is potentially it's not always so successful. And if you see that range, it at least doubles from the projects that scored the lowest to the projects that scored the highest. And that seems to be the case. We see some projects that just do look like they're doing really well and some that aren't. And I think that's the crux of why I'm up here, is because we do have this incredible range, and we have a lot to learn to make it so that there's more in that successful category. And so this study basically asked more questions than answered, but it also gets at this point that we do have a lot more work to do. And one thing that came up in talking about these projects with hydrologists, geomorphologists, is the idea of sediment transport. And so if you think about these mountain meadows, when that water flows out of the steep mountains, hits these meadows, and slows down, it's dropping sediment. It's slowing in flow and dropping sediment. And so it's in a grading system. When you have an incised meadow, of course it just continues on through the channel. It's not dropping sediment in the meadow. And then in several of these pond and plug, and they're all done a little bit differently, but many of them, it helps to control the system if you put a pond right at the top of the meadow and have the water flow into the pond first, and then you can divert it into the meadow floodplain. And when that happens, that sediment is falling out. You're going from fast-moving to still lentic water, and the sediment is falling out. So when you're releasing it into the meadow, it's actually increasing in flow, so that it is basically hungry water. So if you don't have a very protected channel with a turf channel, so to speak, then it can actually be a degrading system. Yes, which creates inherent instability. And an example of this is Trout Creek on the Shasta, and it was one of our studied meadows. It did not score very highly. There's a pond at the top, and then in the channel, this is the hydrologist showing us where the trucks bring in the coarse gravels that try to line that channel to prevent the incision from occurring. And yet, we're still seeing some pretty bad signs of incision. And then I just have to take a minute as an amphibian ecologist to also look at these systems. This is a novel condition. These mid-elevations, usually west side of the Sierra where these meadows occur, weren't naturally lentic systems. And we're putting these ponds on the landscape. And I don't know how many amphibian people are in the room, but you see a habitat like this and you think bullfrogs. And this was one of our study meadows, and I don't know how many bullfrogs were in this system, but probably close to 100,000. And then I was eating lunch at the pond, and the crayfish smelled my sandwich and started coming out of the water. So we don't know what we're doing in terms of potentially allowing invasive species to move in. And if you see the placement of these projects in the Sierra Nevada, they tend to be between the lower elevation habitats where bullfrogs and a lot of invasive species occur, and then in between that and the higher elevation lakes. So I'm not talking science here, but it is a concern in terms of stepping stone potential. And so, meadow restoration in California, where are we? These projects have ramped up in the past decade. This is pretty big. Proposition 1 funds are likely to increase that rate even more. And it's great. We have degraded conditions. Many of these projects involve land alteration, fairly intensive land alteration. Monitoring is focused on documenting success, as many mitigation type projects. And there is some research, but not enough on post-project processes, where we're looking at, did the project succeed in creating a successfully connected system that is stable in the long term? So post-project processes such as incision rates. What are the new rates of incision after the project? We've created this beautiful landscape. What's happening in the long term? And it just truly is difficult for research to keep pace with these restoration efforts throughout California. And then I just want to put in a little plug. Right now we're rushing to try to bring a collaboration together where we can say, let's take the existing projects, let's get some monitoring in place now, look at some of these areas that are areas within each meadow restoration, the control structures at the top and the bottom, areas where we know there's potential red flags, potential problems, and study them and learn using potentially El Nino as our kickoff to say, how stable are these systems? These projects have been built, the vast majority, since 1997. So they haven't really been tested yet. And it may be that this is a good test case. And it'd be really great to collect that data. And with that, I'm going to pass it to the speakers who are going to talk about how to integrate science in with restoration. And I'll start with Sarah Yarnell, who is my partner up here, and she's going to talk a little bit about a project we're just starting up, and then introduce the rest of the speakers.
Okay, so thanks. So with some of these new funding that's been coming through, most recently there was a round of funding that came through the state, through the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. That was the cap and trade funds, is kind of how they're casually called, but I think the full proper name is Carbon Sequestration Greenhouse Gas Emission Proposal, which kicked off a whole round of something like 10 to 12 meadow restoration studies that have recently been funded. And the goal of that project actually is to try to incorporate more science into some of these restoration projects. Similarly, as Karen alluded to, then just this summer there's been another round of Prop 1 money that specifically had an RFP out for upper headwaters meadow restoration and for mountain meadow restoration. And again, the goal there with the RFP that has been specifically allocated is to try to include some of these longer term monitoring processes and science in. So real briefly, I'll introduce one of the projects that has been funded by that cap and trade funding that Karen at PSW and myself and Nature Conservancy and Point Blue have collaboratively working on, which is a restoration in Childs Meadow, which is up by Lassen County. And specifically, we were looking at alternative ways to go about restoring meadows. And one of the more recent discussions that's come about, Michael Pollock and others have, and this is really commonly done in Colorado and Utah and some of the western states, is to actively help reduce beavers into meadows. And then we can talk later afterwards. We can have a nice discussion about the whole thing about whether beavers were really historically in the Sierra Nevada or in Lassen or in the northern Sierra Nevada. That's always a fun discussion. But there are some new techniques out there. One of them is called this idea of beaver dam analogues and planting willows to encourage beaver to come back into the meadows, and the little engineers that they are will actually help maintain some of these structures and help bring those water levels up. So we have up in Child's Meadow, we have a project specifically to look at whether this technique will work. So here's a diagram. This is directly from Michael Pollack's work, the Beaver Restoration Guidebook. You can get this online and download it. And it's a lot of the case studies. There's a couple case studies in California, but most of the work, like I mentioned, is primarily happening in some of the western states. But the idea is that, so you can see there's a picture of, we go in as people and sort of try to mimic and put in a beaver dam structure that would be built in the way that we think a beaver would, plant a bunch of willows in. But really what we're trying to do is encourage the beavers to move back into an area and then themselves to maintain these structures. And the idea is that beaver ponds naturally, they're a way to dam up the creek. They promote deposition of sediment. They slow down that water and spread that water out onto the floodplain. And the beavers then use this habitat to maintain their own life history. And storms do come through, and they can periodically blow out these beaver dams, and the beavers come in and re-engineer them. So it's a long-standing, self-maintaining, natural ecological process that potentially could do a lot better job than we can in terms of maintaining high groundwater levels. So out at Child's Meadow, like I said, this is located up by Lassen. Does this work? This is Highway 36 coming down through. This is a property that is currently owned by TNC. It's been in private hands, I believe, for most of the time as ranch land, and it's being currently turned over. And so we have an opportunity to actually do an ecological experimental study design on this. So this lower section of the meadow runs from upstream to downstream. The lower section of the meadow has beavers that have been naturally recolonizing into this meadow. And so this lower part down here sort of provides a positive control for our study. There are beavers that have come in down here. They've completely reflooded and completely changed the habitat down here. Interestingly, we've seen two sensitive species, the Cascade frog and the willow flycatcher, have reoccupied this area now that the beavers have come back in naturally. And so it provides a nice positive control or a reference state condition for a study. The upper part of this meadow is actively grazed in this portion here. Does not have beaver in it, has very few willows in it. And so we have chosen to put in essentially two treatment sections and a negative control section. So, and then with the idea being that we'll have a before-after control impact analysis study on this over 5 years. So this lower section down here is one of the treatment controls where we will plant willows, do cattle exclusion fencing to keep the cattle out of the riparian area, and put in some of these BDA structures or beaver dam analog structures. This treatment section here, the next section up, we will do just willow planting and cattle exclusion, but not the BDAs, and trying to see what kind of impact that has. And then up here in the upper part, this will provide a negative control for us, where we will plant willows, but we will not do the cattle exclusion, and we will not do the BDA structures. This is a 5-year funded study that just got started this summer. So currently, to date, we have put in some of the fencing. In fact, this weekend, TNC is hosting a volunteer willow planting event on Friday and Saturday. Talk to me if anybody's interested in going up. But we'll be putting in the first round of willow plantings on all of these 3 treatment sections this weekend. And the goal of the project really is to look at these above and below ground carbon values to see whether or not we're going to get increased carbon storage with these restoration techniques. We'll be analyzing hydrogeomorphic conditions and particularly looking at the response of some of these two sensitive species, the willow flycatcher and the Cascade frog. Okay, and so here's an example from that lower beaver section. So here you can see what, this is a natural active beaver dam, what it looks like. And the goal would be, in the treatment section, is for us to go in and plug up the channel, start to put this in, start to get some willows growing, and with the long-term goal of actually trying to encourage the beaver to move upstream into our treatment section. And even initially, if the beaver don't move in, you can see how much sediment gets trapped behind these beaver dams. You can imagine there's a good amount of carbon storage that's going to be happening there, and we'll be making measurements on that in both of these sections. And then this is one of the pictures of the Cascade frog that was sitting like right over here when we were hanging out at lunch one day. And this is exactly the type of habitat that they love. And so, like I've said, as the beaver have come in over the last couple decades, these native species have been following and coming in. Okay, so I just wanted to introduce you to that project as an example of one of the types of restoration projects that is going on currently in California, where we're really trying to take a more scientific approach to evaluating some of these other restoration techniques. And so the next couple talks are going to also be talking about some other projects in other locations where we have different types of restorations going on. We're going to have Rachel Hutchinson from Circle come up, and she's going to talk about Also, one of the cap and trade projects that they have going, as well as a Meadow Restoration project they have. After that, we'll hear from Renee Henry, who's going to be talking about some of the meadow restoration work he's been involved in sort of this larger scale Sierra Nevada-wide work that they've been doing. And lastly, we'll hear from Evan Wolf, who is here at UC Davis and has been working in Yosemite National Park and some of the, looking at some of the impacts from these legacy grazing impacts on some of the areas in there. And with that, I'll introduce Rachel. Thank you.